You're listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
Check, check, 1, 2. Look like a little country, some rock and roll and blues, 'cause we sure love playing for good people like you. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, check, 1, 2.
Welcome to Music Local and Sustainable, the radio show that features discussions with and the music of local musicians. I am your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we have Jeana Melilli in the studio. Jeana is the flute player in a variety of symphony orchestras. She's the principal flute player with the Savannah Philharmonic and also the flute player of the Savannah Baroque. Welcome, Jeana Melilli.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about being in a symphony orchestra. So you have to try out.
Correct. So you spend years and years and years perfecting your craft, and then you take these things called auditions, which a friend of mine has decided to call them pleasure cruises instead. Essentially, an orchestra from a community orchestra all the way up to the New York Philharmonic will advertise in the professional papers or in the local paper, we need flute player, here's your excerpt list. And it's become pretty codified what's going to be excerpted from the repertoire, and you work on those for a few months, and then you arrive and they give you a shorter list of that for a first round, and you play that, and if you advance you get to a semifinal and to a final round, and it's nerve-wracking and terrible, and then sometimes you win, and it's great.
Are there certain pieces that everybody asks you to play?
Some of the more common things that you would see for a principal flute audition, for instance, would be Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun, Beethoven's Lenore Overture No. 3, which has a huge flute solo in it, Brahms Symphony No. 4, and then something that looks terrifying rhythmically like Stravinsky or Shostakovich or something to show your technique. There are excerpt books that the great flutists over time have put out so that you don't have to have these file folders full of actual parts anymore, which I still have, but it's easier to have the book and then just play the typical excerpt.
And then do you have a chance to play something that you've prepared?
Not usually. Sometimes they'll give you a little bit of freedom in the solo. So they'll ask for a solo. It's usually a concerto. It's usually Mozart. On piccolo, it's Vivaldi. Sometimes they'll say a concerto of your choice or a solo piece of your choice, but that's pretty rare. There's very little freedom for the person taking the audition.
You would audition separately for, say, a principal role as the first player, the one that does all the solos out of that section, versus a regular section member.
In the winds, it's a little different because each part really is a solo part. So second flute auditions have their own artfulness to them, but yes, you would have a separate second audition. If it's a big orchestra, they have what's called an assistant principal position, which is someone who might play the first half of a concert, or they just do all the pop shows. They're often the utility flutes, so sometimes alto flute and things like that will show up on an assistant principal audition. And then you have a piccolo audition, which is the auxiliary for our section. They all have their own typical excerpts and their different expectations, so the second flute needs to have a good sound, but a good supporting sound, and so they can play a supporting role for the principal flute. Oftentimes, that final round would entail playing with the principal flute, so you can see if your sounds match and that kind of thing. Piccolo has its own screechy high, wonderful excerpts to play, and I think sometimes committees aren't sure what they want out of that. I'm sure they're sitting there with their hands over their ears most of the time.
In an orchestra like the Savannah Philharmonic, which is a moderate size orchestra, how many flute players are there?
There's 2 of us officially, plus a piccolo player. Not every concert is going to call for all 3 of us to play. And in fact, in January, it's just 1 flute because it's a Baroque concert. Depends on the size. So if we're going to do a Mahler symphony, we're going to have to be a big orchestra all of a sudden. So it's going to need more freelancers from all over to help fill in the ranks. Or if we're just playing Beethoven or a Baroque concert, it's going to be our poor musicians who've been here for a while, so a smaller group. Julie DeMott is our wonderful second flute player, and Regina Helcher-Yost is our piccolo player, who is the second flute also in the Charleston Symphony. We're lucky, though, that we have a great wind section in general in Savannah Phil.
The life of the itinerant flute player is a very interesting one, because I hear of you on the road to a variety of places. What symphonies do you work with?
I am the piccolo player for the Greenville Symphony in Greenville, South Carolina, and the South Carolina Philharmonic in Columbia. And I'm also the piccolo player for the Columbus Symphony in Columbus, Georgia. For a long time, I was playing second flute for the Augusta Symphony, but it just didn't fit in the schedule after a while, but I still get to play with them if I have the opportunity. And then the rest of the time, you're on sub-lists for other orchestras. So I've played with the Atlanta Symphony many times, and I got to play with the Jacksonville Symphony for the first time a couple of weeks ago. So you have contracted positions if you've won auditions, which I have with these orchestras, and then you have sub positions where you're just on a list because of your reputation or playing skill. The principal player would like you to play, if you can, on certain things. And I'm very lucky as a wind player to have as much work as I do, because there's just fewer of us in an orchestra. So it's been quite a 14-year crazy ride, but it's definitely a great gift to be able to play this music September through May steadily every year.
And what other types of gigs do you get as a flute player?
Well, this time of year, you get a lot of church services. So I just played lessons and carols at Wesley Monumental yesterday. It was a beautiful service. And I'll be playing Christmas Eve and Christmas Day services at Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church in Atlanta. I've done that, I think, for 14 years in a row. I'm not sure. Things like that, Easter time. Sometimes churches will pull together an orchestra because their choir wants to do a specific piece that they've worked on, and they've collected the money for it. The other thing I get to do is the historical performance stuff, which I've added to my list of things to do. So I have the wonderful Savannah Baroque group that Ann Acker started. And then in Columbia, South Carolina, Patrick Hawkins started the Vista Ensemble. He's a square piano player, so the little pianos from the 19th century. And we have Erica Cutler on Baroque violin and myself on Baroque flute. So we're a little bit of an anachronism, but those instruments would have played together, especially early on in the 19th century. So those are fun projects that challenge you musically so that you can continue to grow as a musician.
There are a variety of types of flutes.
Yes.
What are the different types of flutes?
Basically, in the modern world, we have the typical silver, or now it's made out of gold or platinum, carbon fiber and titanium also, the typical flute that you would see in bands. The professional flutes are open hole, so they have a little bit more flexibility. Open hole means the keys have an openness to them that lets you have more intonation control, and you can play extended techniques, which is definitely expected of the modern musician, where you can play quarter tones and sing and play at the same time and silly things like that. But the silver was created in the mid-19th century to give us more power in the sound. It didn't take hold until the 20th century. Wooden flutes just were not keeping up in the orchestra as the technology got better for sound production in the strings and the brass and in the other wind sections. So we have our metal modern instruments now. There are many different makers and different scales or different placements of the holes in the tube, so that depending on what kind of player you are, you find your sort of soulmate flute to play.
Flutes really vary.
They do.
The different manufacturers make flutes a little bit differently, or is the same manufacturer make different flutes?
Both things, and they use different materials. So generally a manufacturer is going to use the same scale over and over again. So the placement of the holes is going to be similar. But there's a huge difference between a flute made by a machine and a handmade flute, or a cross of those two things. So that has a impact on the price. There's solid silver head joints. The flute is made of 3 pieces. And then the rest of the body can be silver plate or nickel to cut down on the cost. You could get a solid silver flute with a gold head joint or with a platinum head joint. So there's so many different combinations that you can have. And then there's a lot of different sellers also. So you have places like Flute World, which I kind of call the Walmart of flutes. You have almost every manufacturer's flute there. And when we have flute conventions and things like that, you go and try all the flutes. And first rule of flute convention is don't buy anything because you're spending the price of a nice car on an instrument. You don't want to make a snap decision there. But yeah, it's fascinating. We have probably more options as wind players than many of our colleagues. Clarinets really don't have as many manufacturers. Oboes don't have as many manufacturers. So those differences are within the maker. For us, you have differences within the makers, and then you have hundreds of different flute makers. The same is true for piccolo, which is the smaller wooden instrument that screams over the orchestra and is my personal favorite to play. They can either be made of wood or metal. The metal was more popular for bands and things like that. And then the wooden piccolos just have sort of helped calm down the sound a little bit so that you can have a nice soft. But you have different styles there. So you have German-made piccolos, Hamig and Braun. I have a Braun. And then you have American piccolos that have a little bit different feel, a little bit different shape. I have an American piccolo that's the complete opposite of my German piccolo as my backup, a Powell. It's fun to try and remember where the placement of the notes are for you if you have to switch from one piccolo to the other.
That's really interesting that there's no standardization of either the flute or the piccolo.
There's some standardization and then not. So if I'm going to play a Powell piccolo, there's a standard within that I know that's there. But it just depends on the manufacturer and what they're trying to get out of the sound. I feel like American piccolos are a little bit quieter, and they have a lot of colors, and they have a really different feel to their mechanism. But I find them to be harder to have a consistent intonation. And I think the German-made Hamig and Brahms, they have really solid scale on them. So you know every time where the pitch is going to be. And it has a bigger sound because the European orchestras often have a bigger sound. But I think it also has flexibility to get a nice, sweet, soft sound too. And it just depends on the player's preference and how they blow across the instrument. I can pick up a Powell flute and sound terrible because the cut of the embouchure hole is different from what I'm used to on my flute. So it just depends.
Wow. I had not realized how variable these instruments are from one to another.
Right, they really are. It's kind of like, especially head joints, so you can get into people who make specifically just different head joints for flutes and piccolos. And so you have different cuts of head joints for piccolos. You can have a regular round embouchure hole, or you can have a little wave, and the wave is supposed to help with people who switch back and forth between flute and piccolo who feel more uncomfortable playing the piccolo. I can't really play on a wave because I feel really comfortable switching back and forth between them. There's those options. There's different metals, of course. And then there's all kinds of interesting little accessories for the flute that are supposed to improve the sound. And it's a wild world, very creative world of selling interesting little pieces of metal to flute players.
You're listening to Music Local and Sustainable, and I'm your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we have flute player Jeana Melilli in the studio. The type of metal, does that influence the sound, or is it just an aesthetic thing?
It does influence the sound. The heavier the metal, the bigger the sound can be, the more projecting the sound can be. In fact, there's a piece by Varese called Density 21.5, which is the density of platinum. And he wrote it for the first platinum flute that was produced, and Georges Barrère premiered the piece. But that also depends on the players. I'm 5 feet tall. I'm not going to sound good on a platinum flute. It takes so much air. It's very heavy. I have a solid silver instrument, which I think projects very beautifully. I have the lip plate on it, which is the raised part of the head joint that has the embouchure hole where you blow into it, is gold. So that gives a little bit more sound to the flute. But if I had an entirely gold flute, I probably couldn't make that be the zinging, beautiful sound that other people who play on gold flutes have. The beginner flutes are made out of nickel, partially so that it can be an affordable instrument, and partially so that as you're learning to play the flute, you're not using all of your air trying to produce a sound. So once your student is starting to get a big sound on their nickel instrument, they're going to outgrow it. They need the weight of solid silver. And that's also a misnomer. It's always an alloy. It's never going to be solid silver. It would just be dented all the time. So they do mix the metals, but it has pretty high content of silver in it.
Within the flute family, are there different tunings of the flute?
Yes. That has a lot to do with the placement of the holes. We call them the scale. For instance, my Arista flute, which is made up in Boston, and Altus and Jack Moore use the William Bennett scale. William Bennett is a famous flutist from Britain. And then there's also the Cooper scale, which Brannon Brothers and Muramatsu use as their scale. Haynes, the company, has its own. Powell has its own. So you pick up a flute, and on my flute, the C sharp, which is all keys are open, so it's the most flexible of the notes. It's not quite as sharp as it is in the Cooper scale or the Powell or the Haynes scale. That's just one of the things that William Bennett wanted to work out of his scale. But there might be other issues with it that a different scale would have. So it depends on what kind of problems that you would like to solve and what kind of problems you do not want to have. And each scale is a little bit different. They also make flutes pitched at 442. So many orchestras tune to 440, but the pitch keeps going up and up and up. So it's a little bit easier if your instrument is pitched a little bit higher. It's easier to go down to 440, but you can get up a little bit higher should the orchestra choose to play on the brighter side. So there's that also. That's placement of the cork in the head joint, which kind of controls the intonation of the whole instrument. So there's those options.
Does a flute player generally play, even if they have multiple flutes, the one with the same types of scales?
Generally, yes. So it's important to have backup instruments because, like a car, it's going to break down. It needs its 20,000 note check every now and then, and it needs to be clean oiled and adjusted. So you need a good backup instrument to play if you're constantly playing. I do not have flutes that are of the same scale. I have a wonderful old Haynes from 1960, which I actually prefer to play. It doesn't have the projection of this newer flute, but I feel like it has more personality. But it is what we would all say is completely out of tune, as William Bennett, who I mentioned before, calls Haynes and Powell Pains and Howl. But the Haynes was actually my first flute, and it's a great instrument. I played it for 20 years before I got the flute I have now. It's very different playing that, but I'm so used to it, it almost comes back immediately how to play it. I think most people probably have a similar instrument that they would have as a backup that's maybe not got as much of the fancy medals or fancy options on the flute as their regular flute. So I hope that most people choose to have a similar flute as a backup. Same with the piccolos. Like I said, the Powell's completely opposite from the Braun. So I probably set myself up for failure with having these very different instruments. But it's also fun to explore that.
And also flutes come in alto flute.
Right. I did not bring Tinkerbell, the alto flute, because I just didn't want to carry her around. But yes, there is an alto flute. There's a bass flute. There's a giant contrabass flute that's basically you have to stand up to play it. It's a giant piece of plumbing with a little sort of a shape of the letter A at the top, so it bends around and you blow into it, and then sometime tomorrow the sound will happen. So yeah, they get lower and lower. Alto flute's becoming more and more popular, especially movie scores. So I wound up buying my own a few years ago because it kept showing up pretty reliably in a season 2 or 3 times. Any new compositions, new operas and things like that. It's a very typical instrument. I can't play anything larger than an alto flute or I'll tip over. Alto flutes can come with a straight head joint, so it's a longer instrument because it's lower, or you can get a curved head joint so that the distance to the keys is not as far, so I have to play on the curved head joint of the alto flute.
There are wind instruments that have a deeper tone. Is it just the particular sound that a composer is after when they go for a deeper flute rather than, say, a clarinet or a bassoon or the different wind instrument?
I think so. I think as composers are exposed to more auxiliary instruments, especially I think today's composers are just looking for completely new sounds. Especially in movies, you still want some kind of tonality. So you're not really experimenting with music construction But you could experiment with the texture and sound of something. So you would find these interesting instruments. With the rise of ethnomusicology, we also have the world instruments, so different flutes and different string instruments and things from other countries that are being worked into westernized music also to create a different sound. But yeah, the alto flute's got this really smooth, beautiful, kind of jazzy sound. And the French composers, then not French, Shostakovich and Stravinsky, Holst all put alto flute in their famous scores. So we have Rite of Spring, we have Daphnis and Chloe, The Planets, and Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony has a big alto flute solo. It's sometimes surprising when they make the choice. And then, of course, you have to be like, okay, orchestra, no one play anything. The alto flute's playing because it's just not very loud.
Is that because of its size and the power you have to put behind it?
Yeah, it sort of spreads the sound, I think. So a lot of instruments occupy that space a lot more strongly, like the clarinet or the low octave of the oboe, the viola. All those things can be louder than what an alto flute can do. So it's really just a different color and a quieter sound, and that breathy sort of flute sound.
Now let's talk about the parts of the flute. You were talking about the headpiece and the body. So there are three main parts, you said, to the flute?
Right. So the modern flute has three main parts. It has a foot joint, which has just 4 keys. And then the main body of the flute is where all the holes are that you depress to get the notes, and then you have the head joint. Head joint is responsible for creating the sound. The embouchure hole and lip plate are on the head joint. The cork is in the head joint, and that's what sets the length of the tube and controls the intonation. And so that's where all of the sound and your reverberation, your air, that's what is transferred into flute sound in the head joint. And then the keys, you're basically just moving your fingers around the air of the flute. And there's 2 different lengths of foot joint. You have a C foot, which goes down to low C or middle C on the piano, and then they have a B foot, which adds 1 more key and a little bit of length. Many professional flutes prefer the B foot flute because it helps bring the pitch of the upper register down, which tends to be sharp. It's a little bit longer, and then you get an extra note. It's really important to play that low B, which is really hard to hear. The piccolo only has 2 parts because it's teeny tiny, so it's just got the head joint and then the body, which has all the keys. It does not have that low C foot. Braun has made one with a low C, but the piccolo sounds an octave higher. So the fingerings are the same, but the low D on piccolo is an octave and a note higher than middle C. Piccolo is stronger in that really high upper register, which the flute can get up there, but why? That's why you have a piccolo.
When you see a flute player come out and they then twist the headpiece back and forth, that's the tuning.
Yes, there's 2 things that they're doing. They're adjusting the length of the tube by pulling out or pushing in the head joint. Pull out, it's going to make it lower, and if you push the head joint in, it's going to make it higher in pitch. So it just depends on where the orchestra is, or if it's freezing out, probably you're going to need to push in a little bit more because it's going to be flat. And then the other thing that we're adjusting is the relationship of the embouchure hole to the first key on the body, because that's going to affect where the embouchure hole is against your lip, so that you're maximizing the air across the embouchure hole. And so sometimes it can be less than a millimeter off and it drives us crazy, or we at least think that it's going to fix something if we move it in or out, and it makes us feel better.
You're listening to Music Local and Sustainable, and I'm your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we have flute player Jeana Melilli in the studio. Let's talk a little bit about your background. How did you pick up the flute and why the flute?
I wanted to play the French horn because I'm left-handed, and that made sense when I was in 5th grade. My mom was a clarinet player, a really good clarinetist, and she had started out on the flute and then switched to clarinet, and then she wanted to switch back to flute, and her parents wouldn't let her, so she stayed and mastered the clarinet. I had played the piano from the time I was 5, so I was familiar with music, and Mom had made sure I knew all the instruments. My dad apparently tried to play the trumpet when he was in middle school and it didn't work out. So he wasn't much of a musician, but he was very supportive. I had braces and the orthodontist said, no, you can't play the French horn. And I was very disappointed. Mom said, well, why don't you play the flute since I played the clarinet and I wanted to go back to the flute. And I said, all right, fine. And then I was struck by how much easier it was to read one line of music instead of two. The only complication of the flute really is getting the sound out because it's the only wind instrument that you blow across it to get a sound. So a lot of our air goes out into the room. It doesn't all go directly into the instrument. It's a lot like singing because we don't have any reverse pressure coming back at us. Once you master that part of it, the fingering on the flute, I think, is the easiest. We have a fewer number of keys than clarinets or oboes or bassoons. So just learn the fingering system, and then there are a few alternate fingerings and things like that, but not as many choices as other instruments. So I think the technique of the flute is easier. So that's how I got into playing the flute and not the French horn. I still am grateful for that because when I see people dragging their larger instruments into rehearsals and I just have my little tiny instrument, I am very grateful. The French horn, it's a hard instrument. I got a great exercise on the flute from a French horn player because it's so hard to just pick up the horn and play a note. Pick up the horn, play a D, and then put it down, and then pick up the horn and play a completely different note. And that's what they often practice doing, and I started doing that on the flute because sometimes just starting a note is hard, but not as hard for us as it is for them. They have a lot of work to do to make their instrument sound amazing. And then when it works, it works. It's just great.
Yeah. To me, there's nothing better than a great French horn player.
Right. They are
the great
amazing.
sound of French horn, but it's very difficult. So I think you made the right choice.
Me too.
Despite it being driven by the orthodontist.
Right. They have too much power.
Let's talk a little bit about different technique that may be unique to the flute. Mm-hmm. What can you do that other instruments can't do?
We have a lot of facility, and that comes out in the parts that we have to play. So a friend of mine who's an oboist, and she was having to play second oboe on a Shostakovich symphony, and she said, thank God for the piccolo player, because you can't hear the rest of the wind section doing it. If the piccolo has it, we're golden, It's not easy, of course, to play that kind of stuff, but it's easier on our instrument than for other instruments. So we have that. We have a different way of blowing. So we're blowing across the instrument. We don't have to buzz. We don't need a reed. So that makes it a little bit easier to produce a sound once you master that art.
Actually, is the only woodwind without a reed.
Correct.
The others have either a single or a double reed.
Correct. Right. And we're the only one now made out of metal and all that. So we're kind of in our own category. And then, of course, you have these beautiful melodies that are written for it. We can be more like the human voice, which is what a lot of instruments want to copy or want to sound like. We are often the bird in different pieces, so that's our guiding animal on our totem, flute totem. It's fun to be able to make those sounds and make them beautiful. The flute is just a beautiful instrument.
You're listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
If you enjoy our programming on WRUU-LP, please support the station with a donation. As an individual, you can give any amount, become a basic station member, or become a serious fan of the station. To check out membership rates and to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Again, to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUU-LP.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by support from the 2018 Savannah Music Festival, which runs from March 29 through April 14, 2018, presenting classical artist Murray Pariah, the Zuckerman Trio, Atlanta Symphony Orchestra with Robert McDuffie, Stile Antico, Daniel Hope and Friends Chamber Music Series, and more. Information at savannahmusicfestival.org.
You're listening to Music Local and Sustainable, and I'm your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we have flute player Jeana Melilli in the studio. Are there particular techniques that you use to get the different sounds that the flute can produce?
One of the things about the silver flute is that we can play with equal power in all the registers. That was not true of the Baroque flute. So that actually can make us sound more homogenized. We can sound just as loud in the low register as the upper register, and we can accidentally have less color if we're not thinking about it. To avoid that, you make sure that you have a flexibility of sound so that you can get the power in the low register, but you can also get it to be soft and projecting. Or you can get a lot of projection in the high register, but you can also get a really nice taper and a really nice fade in the upper register, which can be beautiful. So all of that means that you're working very hard to shape the inside of your mouth and to shape the lips to get the air to do what you want to do so the flute responds in the right way. And that, I think, every flute player spends the majority of their time on. It sounds like we just practice scales all the time because of the things that we have to play, but it really has to do with controlling the air through the instrument. Because we have so many variables, with that open embouchure of just being able to blow across, we've got 180 degrees of where we can blow the air out toward you or up toward the ceiling, and all the way to the left, all the way to the right, straight across. You can do a lot with the air to change not only intonation, but color and projection dynamics. So it's a really flexible instrument. One of my teachers told me that if the wind section is out of tune, it's the flute player's fault, because we have the ability to change the intonation within a second, whereas there's not as much space on the reed or the vocal or whatever for the other instruments.
Now, embouchure. What do you mean by embouchure?
Embouchure is the opening, the aperture, the shape of your mouth when you're playing. There's a lot of different ways to have one for the flute. There's a lot of different schools of thought on that. There are very rigid ones that you must play a certain way, and there are some who are more flexible how to play across it. There's the frowny face embouchure, where you kind of really push out your lower lip and control the air that way. There's a more, I like to use the term smug sort of look, where the lips are kind of equal for the low register to get the sound out. So there's different shapes, but basically we bring the air to the center of our mouth to blow across the flute. And the challenge is to keep the lips apart as you speed up the air for the upper register so that you don't buzz and turn into a trumpet player by accident, or cover too much of the embouchure hole itself on the flute so that you don't get all of the air going into the flute the right way, so you get kind of a covered flat sound. So you have to be careful about not only the relationship of the embouchure hole to the lip, but where that air can be placed. So there's just a lot of variables happening right at the point of air departure.
You said when you have a metal flute, you can be strong throughout the entire range, but you want to avoid just being strong. You want to get that subtlety to this tone.
Right.
Is it the changing the embouchure and changing the direction of the breath that really changes that character?
That's exactly right. There are people who can just pump out air and blow across the flute for days and have this huge sound in all registers. But if you don't also work on relaxing that air, slowing it down, changing its direction, changing the speed of it and all of that, then you get a really great projecting, vibrant sound that doesn't change. Nuanced is what we want on the flute.
It's really interesting when you watch the woodwind section. You see all these people turning red in the face, and then you see the flute players who seem quite relaxed. I don't want to say it doesn't look like they're working, because they're obviously working very hard, but they don't look like they're putting everything into it like all the other players who are turning all sorts of colors. Right. And is that because of the fact that you don't have that backflow, that back pressure
Correct.
that you have to overcome?
Exactly. There's no back pressure. I play clarinet badly. So when you pick up a clarinet and you get the back pressure and you're like, whoa, what's that? Not all of your air is going into the instrument. So if you're blowing up a balloon, your face is going to turn red. If we're just talking, our faces don't turn red. So it's that kind of thing. Flute is just talking. It takes actually way more air to play the flute than any of the other wind instruments because not all of our air is going into the instrument. One of the, I think, kind of stupid expectations of the flute player is to be able to play these long phrases and never breathe. For instance, Afternoon of a Faun is supposed to be done in one breath because supposedly that's what happened the first time. And then the real story comes out that there were not one person, but the entire flute section was playing it, and then they took breaths wherever they wanted to. And then there's a new edition by Bärenreiter, which is the famous Urtext German edition. The score just came out, and there's a big old breath mark in the solo. So we need to breathe in order to play the flute. You don't want to breathe every single note. That's not how we speak or sing or anything. You want to make the air work, but I don't think we want to go off the deep end and play and pass out before we have to take another breath. But that's the challenge of flute phrasing. So that's what we're working on while our colleagues are turning red is, oh no, I have to breathe again. Where can I do it? Because there's not a place to do it.
So it takes more air to play the flute, but less pressure.
Right.
And you work then with the second flute player to determine where you take breaths so that you have a more consistent sound from the section?
It depends on the piece. So if we're in unison, especially if we're in unison in the orchestra, we might breathe in separate places just to have the continuous sound of the flute line. But if we're playing a duo, we'd want to breathe together. Unless it's a contrapuntal sort of situation where each melody has its own direction. So yeah, we would coordinate that, but we would decide differently depending on the piece.
Just as with bowing of a string instrument, the sound varies depending on where you are on the bow. Does the sound vary a lot in terms of where you are in your breath?
It can. So the air is our bow. If you're running out of air, you have to work very hard to show that you're not running out of air. So if I didn't do anything as I was running out of air, the sound would go flat. If I didn't do anything to start the sound, it would be very sharp because that explosion of air and articulation makes the instrument respond in a sharp way. So you have to kind of shape that with the inside of your mouth with a vowel shape like an O or an U shape. And then the same at the end, you want to push the air higher with your lower lip and really support with abdominal muscles. Like you're holding up the pitch with those muscles at the end so it doesn't go flat. And then look like you don't want to just run and get a billows to blow your lungs back up.
You said because of your petite size, I would presume because of smaller lungs, that it's more of a challenge for someone like you than someone who is larger.
I probably have more of a complex about it than I should because no one ever says, hey, you don't have any air. But that's what it feels like to me. So, for instance, I'm a runner because of that, and because of its many health benefits, but also it makes that air capacity stronger and helps me feel more confident in my own ability to make it to the end of the phrase. But I do think that I probably take more breaths than traditionally I should. At the same time, that the whole concept is sort of, I think, changing a little bit, and it's more about the music and less about that particular strange requirement on flute players.
And so you carry your flutes in what looks like a circular bag.
I have a Wiseman case, which is a different kind of case from the French case, which is what typically flutes come in. It holds the flute a little bit better. Actually more useful for the bassoonists and bass clarinetists because the shape of the case fits better on airplanes than their giant kind of rectangular cases, but they also made one for flute players because flute players will buy anything. The only problem with it is it's got Velcro opener and snaps, so if you're late to rehearsal or concert, you're in trouble trying to get your instrument out. We haven't talked much about the Baroque flutes, but they come in a nice little case that doesn't really have any protection, but it also has the Velcro.
Of course, in Baroque period, they did not have the Velcro.
No, I have an anachronistic case.
Now, when you do something like a whole Baroque concert, you'll still use the flute because of the power necessary for the symphony orchestra.
Right, so you have to make a choice when you play Baroque music. If you're going to do it on modern instruments at modern pitch, Then you make phrasing choices based off of either you want it to be a more romantic, sort of lots of vibrato and sound, or you want it to be kind of a hybrid, historically informed performance where you're not using as much vibrato and not using as much sound on your modern instrument, but you're still at modern pitch and you're still playing on modern instruments. So that's still going to make you phrase in a more modern way. We have a big concert in January with Savannah Philharmonic that's Royal Baroque. There will be some Handel's Royal Fireworks and Water Music, and then I'm playing a piccolo concerto by Vivaldi. And I don't own a Baroque piccolo. I wish I did. But, of course, since it is a modern orchestra, I would play it on modern piccolo anyway. It's actually written for sopranino recorder. It's hard to make that decision, especially if you play original instruments or copies of original instruments. You don't ever, after that, want to play Baroque music on modern instruments. But you can change the way you're phrasing or the way you sound to match that kind of light and bubbly Baroque sound.
I've been listening more and more to historically informed playing.
Right.
Even if it's not done on Baroque instruments,
right.
It's done more out of the various handbooks that came out of the Baroque period.
Right.
So that the players are using the more style of Baroque music. So once you start listening to that, it's very, very difficult to listen to it performed in any other way.
Right. And the big danger that we have with any interpretation is just being convinced that we're right. Because when you do read the treatises, when you read Quantz and Tromlitz, and then you read C.P. Ebach and some others, you understand that there's a high level of disagreement even then. So we can't be convinced of our correctness. But it's such fun to explore it and to see how you play those original instruments and how you would phrase something, because there are limitations on the original instruments that you don't have on the modern instrument, or maybe there's limitations on the modern instrument that you don't have on the original instrument. But also you have just more choices. If you're more open to that, it's more fun to explore it than to say, okay, I have to play this way with no vibrato and I have to do this trill this way because this treatise says it. But then you find treatise 3 and 4 that tell you, well, you could do whatever you want. Especially the Quantz, which gives you an entire chapter that's many pages long of, if you're approaching this note this way, then you play it this way. And if you're, and you can put that chart up, and then at the end of it, it says, of course, it's all done to your own taste. And you're like, well, you just wrote this whole chapter. What do you want me to do now? Baroque music seems simple, but what that means is it demands more of you as a musician. So as we get into the 19th, the 20th, 21st centuries, composers are basically telling us what to do. And if you're told what to do, you can kind of check out and do. If you're good at following instructions, you're going to give a great performance, and it's going to be good. But if you are faced with a bass part to Pachelbel's canon or whatever, if you don't put that energy into it and you sit back and just follow your instructions, then you're not giving a good performance, because that expectation of you knowing everything about music is there in the Baroque stuff. So they kind of expected you to play multiple instruments and to be able to compose and to be able to realize figured bass and to be able to ornament. And all of that is required of today's jazz musician and all of the really great orchestral and classical musicians can do it also. But sometimes we get a little tired, or a little, Mahler told us in German exactly what to do, so we'll just do it, and that's fine. But it's great when you do discover this higher expectation of you in Baroque music to apply that to everything. And it just enriches your performance and what you're giving to your listeners.
So we have 4 flutes. Let's just start with the standard flute.
All right, so this is my wonderful flute. It's made by Miguel and Juan Arista. They used to work for Haynes, and now they work for themselves up in Boston. It's just got a pretty nice sound. Let's see.
Demonstrate some different techniques that you do in terms of some of the things we talked about in terms of changing the airflow and changing the position with the embouchure hole.
If I just blew across the flute, didn't think about it. It's nice, but it's not... It didn't change at all. It didn't have any direction. So in order to change that, I have to change the air as I blow through these slurs. As I come to the end of the phrase, I might want to taper off so that it's lifting. And that, I'm using my lower lip to blow the air higher to get the taper. So if I don't blow the air higher, but I still taper, I go flat. And that maintains the sound a little bit longer, and it makes this nice little sort of feather shape to the sound. So that's one of the hard things that we have to work on. It involves a lot of jaw motion and moving around the inside of the mouth so that it makes it space for the air in the proper way.
You're listening to Music Local and Sustainable, and I'm your host, Dave Lake. Tonight we have flute player Jeana Melilli in the studio. So as you are running to the end of your breath, you change your embouchure.
Exactly.
To maintain that same tone. Otherwise, you would go flat.
Correct. And if I'm not careful in the upper register, I can go way too sharp. But if I open the inside of the mouth, like I'm stifling a yawn. So if I'm a bored flute player, so that I have an open sound and it's projecting out and it's not too sharp. It's still going to go a little bit sharp. That's just what happens. So you turn to your friends in the wind section and say, hey, that G, it's a little high. Sorry. But it helps control, keeps you within an acceptable range of intonation.
Now, would you care to do a sample of one of the audition pieces?
Sure, I'll do a terrible example of the Mendelssohn Scherzo. So he wrote this scherzo for the Midsummer Night's Dream, and at the end of it, the flute has to play this crazy, articulated, but fun and playful piece. And you're supposed to not ever breathe, and I didn't really warm up today, so we'll see if this happens. It's funny, you're supposed to breathe twice in there, and I forgot what notes I was playing, so I took an extra breath. But that's usually a first round piece, so something that you would have to play. The committee's usually behind a screen, and that's one of the things that you would have to do. And if you take the breath or you miss a note, then goodbye. Thank you very much. So that's one of the few I haven't really actually done in context. You know, as the years pass, you're like, oh, well, I've done that one for real. And it's always very different as an excerpt.
So what's one of your favorite pieces to play?
Favorite pieces to play? Anything old, all the Baroque stuff, Bach sonatas and Vivaldi, Telemann.
Would you like to play something related to that?
Sure. This piece is the Bach Partita in A minor. I think I can see it. Yeah. This is for flute alone, and it's one of the most important pieces written for flute. He wrote about 6 sonatas for flute. Some of them we think maybe C.P.E. Bach wrote because J.S. Bach, the father, went blind, and he had his son copying his music, and so it's in the wrong handwriting sometimes. But this piece it's scary to play as a recital piece because every flute player knows it. So if you have flute players in the audience, they're like, oh no, they're all going to judge me. The first movement is an allemande. There is no place to breathe in it, so we have to just stop and take a breath. He may have written it for a flute player who supposedly could circular breathe. I think he just really wanted the flute player to take their time when they needed to breathe. And of course, like most Bach, it starts with the 16th note, not start on the downbeat. Yeah, the whole piece is just, it's always a great thing to pull out and play.
Well, let's go ahead and compare that to the Baroque flute.
Baroque flute is very different from the modern flute. It has one key as opposed to the mini on that one. And the one key was a huge improvement over the Renaissance flute, which had no keys. It was just 6 holes. Baroque flute is in 4 pieces, and it is made of wood. This is a copy of a Dutch flute. It was made in 2015, but I think it's a beautiful instrument. This flute is at 415, which is the typical tuning that the historical performance people sort of came up with in the 50s, that we knew it was lower than what we were doing. We're not sure how much lower. And there are some flutes made at 392 or 400, so we can go even lower, but 415 has become the accepted pitch. So the first thing to notice about the Baroque flute is you can't play with the same strength on every note, which many modern flute players think is a bad thing, but I think it gives you a lot more color choices. And the composers knew that the flute had weak notes and strong notes, so composers would write in certain keys for it. So D major and G major, B minor, E minor, those are the really strong keys for the flute. And of course we have B minor and E minor sonatas from Bach. We have the 2 Mozart concertos, which could be played on the one key flute. They had added a few keys by then, still in G major and D major, because those were still the better keys. So that's what the modern flute really helped with, making it be able to play chromatically. If I tried to play chromatically on this, so there's strong notes and weak notes. If I try to make those weak notes stronger, like a G sharp, it sounds really terrible. So there's nothing you can do except to accept that it's going to be a weaker note and to just cultivate that different sound on it. So because of that, one thing that we do as modern players on the flute is we kind of bring out low notes a lot of the times because we can play loud in the low register on the flute. But that's not necessarily how you would phrase on a Baroque flute. So I'll see if I can play a little bit of this partita I just did on the modern flute on this to show it's just a different idea of the phrasing. Also, I've got these crazy intonation issues on the Baroque flute that don't exist on the modern flute that you have to get really used to and would need more practicing in this particular piece. So the E on this instrument is pretty sharp if I don't change anything. You can do the same things that you do on the modern flute, or you can use your thumb to kind of roll the flute in and out to quickly change. Same thing with the F. If I don't adjust, it's super sharp. And then there's not much difference between F and F sharp. So I have to lower the F, raise the F sharp to get to the G. And all those things you have to be thinking about very quickly as you're playing a piece like this. So it becomes a giant puzzle of how to make the intonation work within the context of the music, and the music, of course, being the most important thing that you want to get across to the listener. So it feels like more work, or you can see it as I have more possibility of color. And for the listener to get used to a little bit of incorrect intonation, not equal temperament, because that's not what they were using back then. It existed in the world, but they allowed for these slightly different changes. The biggest thing for me that I learned on Baroque flute was that there could be different fingerings for G sharp and A flat, or for A sharp and B flat, because A sharp is just A little sharper, and B flat is B a little flatter. So B flat's actually higher than A sharp. So we have A, A sharp, B flat. A Baroque flute is made out of 4 pieces, so it has the 2 inside pieces are your 2 sets of where your left hand and your right hand go, so you can kind of change that, and then you have the pinky key. And this stem, which is the one next to the head joint, can be lengthened. So it's longer on my 415 flute than it is on my 440. And I also have a 430 stem to play early classical music. And that's a crazy sound space to be in, because it's not quite a whole step or a half step down. Once you get into the Baroque flute world, you get into a Baroque flute buying habit that one needs to avoid, because you can get about 5 of these for the cost of one modern flute. So, yeah.
And then there's the piccolo.
The piccolo, the screaming little stick. It's a great instrument. It's still made of wood. It's really fun. So I get to play at the end of January Vivaldi's Piccolo Concerto. He wrote 3 concertos, 2 in C major and 1 in A minor, and I just did the less famous C major one with the South Carolina Philharmonic in honor of my teacher Carl, who passed away. And then there's the famous one that's usually on auditions, and then this A minor concerto. And then we have no solo literature for the piccolo again until about halfway through the 20th century. And now there are competitions for composers to write it because of the National Flute Association. So we'll see. We'll see how it does on the radio. So, second movement of the Vivaldi A minor. There's the famous C major one. It's just a lot of arpeggiation. Sounds like Vivaldi. And then you get into the orchestral repertoire, and you have to be the crazy, screamy piccolo. My favorite is Tchaikovsky's 4th Symphony, 3rd movement. It's the pizzicato string movement, and then all of a sudden the oboes come in, and you have this crazy arpeggiation figure that you have to play. And the piccolo has sat there for 20 minutes through the 1st and 2nd movement, because we don't play on that. And then you have to come in on a high A. Out of nowhere. It's just great. I love it.
So tonight we've had flute player Jeana Melilli here in the studio, and I want to thank you so very much for coming in and sharing with us everything about the flute.
Thank you. It was fun.
This has been another edition of Music Local and Sustainable, and I've been your host, Dave Lake. Save this time for another show next week.
Well, I know we ain't headed for the Hall of Fame. Gonna give it what we got, man, that ain't no shame. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, check, 1, 2. Let me know if you can hear me. Check, check, 1,